All right, guys, this episode is going to be really, really great. We are doing a deep dive on the COVID vaccines and on functional nutrition in this episode with Dr. Jared Seigler, a really great guy. I'm so excited for you to hear it. However, when we were doing the recording, there were some technical issues on my end. And fortunately, Dr. Seigler was very kind to allow us to use his recording software for this episode. But there's a lot of audio on my end that got cut out and was kind of choppy. So I'm re-recording a bunch of it for you so that you can hear everything nice and clean, but there might be some points during the interview where you hear some strange background noise or my voice appears to cut in and out, and that is because of technical issues on my side. So I wanted to let you guys know that before you started listening to the show, so that you know not to blame Jared for the problems that were caused by me and my computer. So without wasting any more of your time, let's go ahead and get into that conversation. This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Jared Seigler. Jared is a certified functional medical provider who focuses on healing the body through functional medicine. He worked with the Living Proof Institute for several years and now runs his own independent practice. I was a patient under his care at the outbreak of the pandemic in 2020, and Jared has volunteered to come on the show to talk about his background and the real science behind the mRNA vaccines that were developed during the pandemic. Jared, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Alex. It's a pleasure to be here, man.
Well, I am really excited to have you here today. You know so much about the vaccines and about functional health. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a very long time, and I think my audience is really going to love it. But before we get into the details, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and your work.
Yeah, father of two. I got into functional medicine because my wife was told she could never be pregnant. And, this is a religious kind of based podcast as well. So I'd say I always believe nothing is going to fix the body better than it can fix itself. It's simply the way it's designed. It's even the approach I took when we were working on you. I said, well, let's focus on health, right? Because you can't be sick and healthy at the same time. And we don't have a healthcare model in the US. We have a sick care model. So it's very unfortunate that's the case. But, I wanted to work with athletes, I thought, for at least a decade. I was a strength coach, working with athletes. I was working in a thing called the BioFreeze Clinic at my chiropractic school. So that's my traditional training as chiropractor. But then I learned about functional medicine, and my wife was my first patient. She had her first cycle in 5 years. She was given a label of PCOS. And after we fixed her gut, quote unquote, she had her first cycle in like a month. It didn't even take that long. That's why I was just like, wow, because I know healing is possible. And now I have a son that's almost 2 as well, and our daughter is 10. But after that point, I didn't really care about low back pain, 40-yard time with pads, anything like that. Because there's chiros that are way better at that than me. But then I helped my wife's brother. He has Crohn's, and he didn't need to have a resection surgery where they were going to take out some of his bowels. So we're able to get him off his medication, stop a surgery. I just looked at my wife. I was like, this is what I want to do. I was like, I can noticeably change people's lives. And I know you can't buy your way into heaven, but I jokingly say I know where my wife and kids are going. So I figure if I help enough people, maybe I can squeak into. Yeah, I know it's a joke, but not to be taken lightly. But that's where I just feel there's the biggest gap, because like I have chronic disease, I have autoimmunity. I found out my wife has autoimmunity. And I just say, if you're shot, our hospitals are the best in the world for that. That's what our whole healthcare model was built off of, was World War II emergency medicine. But people with chronic disease fall through the cracks, and the cracks are just so huge that they don't even know what to do with all these people anymore. I mean, I work with mainly autistic kids and things like that now. And I mean, the little daycare centers are full. They're like waiting for autistic. I know it sounds bad. They're like waiting for autistic kids to die so their kid can go to that care facility now. It's a very sad situation, because when people are like, oh, it's going to bankrupt the system, neurodegeneration or Alzheimer's or whatever, they're like, it's going to do it. I'm like, the shore is already here. I was like, it's just nobody's really paying attention. But when we have in the state of New Jersey, like 1 out of almost 30 boys is now autistic. And when we statistically look at that, like, well, There's 7 people that are affected, and typically one family member has to quit their job and become an unpaid healthcare worker because they just have to do it because the healthcare system doesn't know what to do with them. So I say, so it's already here. So not to sound mean, but that's why I try to train doctors too. I just say there's too many sick people. Even if I was the only doctor in my town, I couldn't see everyone. There's just that's like the saddest state of affairs to me because our healthcare model, if we look at it like a NASCAR track, we're the most expensive car on the track, but we come in last every dead time for outcomes. It doesn't make any sense, and then we just dump more money into it. So it's just not a working model for what people are dying from these days, unfortunately.
So you did do some time in the service, and that had a massive impact on your worldview and on the way that you understand the shaping of narratives and propaganda and things like that. And that's directly connected to your understanding of, popular narratives surrounding health and wellness and exercise and all of those things. So tell us a little bit about your time in the service and what that meant for you.
Yeah, yeah. Oh man. So I was smart. My family says I'm real smart. I graduated high school 4.83, but I didn't go. So there was a whole absent thing. And honestly, because I was homeschooled initially, but I wanted to go play sports with my friends. Like I want to be on the baseball team. I want to be on the football team. I want to be on the soccer team with my friends. Um, but I just told my dad, I was like, dude, school is boring. I'm like, we learned the same stuff today that we learned yesterday, and we're just going to do it again tomorrow. I'm like, what's the point? I already know this stuff. Like, it's so mundane. But as you know, I love teachers, but the system's broke, right? So I just say, like, and you have to
Yeah.
teach that way. Like, you're not to sound mean, but I think of public schools as kind of, there's nothing public about it. It's government funded. But I say it's kind of a government funded indoctrination center at this point. There's like a billion reasons why I homeschool my kids now. But back to being a vet. So I joined the Guard to pay for college because I wasn't smart enough to apply for any scholarships, and I didn't have the dedication that a lot of those scholarships look for, because they look at the absences and they're like, dude, you barely went to school. It makes us think you're going to go to college. So I joined the Guard to pay for that. And then there's, you sign on the line, you're government property now. So I had to go to Katrina, did some border patrol stuff, which that's a whole nother, not even like today. This was back in 2006. But in 2005 was like my major wake up call. We're down at Katrina, no power, no water, nothing, right? Real bad. I learned how people can change in less than 24 hours. So I told my wife, I'm not scared of a lack of food. I'm scared of other people that don't have food. Because just for context, we were there at like 8 in the morning and the dam broke at like midnight. Like I got a call at like 2 in the morning. They're like, come to formation. We're going to be on the plains. Got to get you there by about sunup. And we're like, okay. So we were like there at ground zero, helicoptered us into the Superdome, which surprisingly enough, anyways, I want to get into we had to do the combat stuff because I'm like, why is this a combat zone? That was actually one of the major reasons we had to go in like that, is they were shooting at FEMA helicopters, but I digress. So anyways, after a few days, power comes back on. One of my captains has a cell phone. So I was like, dude, can I call my mom? Just let her know I'm okay. It's like, she's probably freaking out. So get on the phone and she's freaking out because she's like, there's so many thousand dead and this, that, and the other. And we were on Decatur, which I've been in New Orleans once after Katrina, definitely PTSD. I see the Superdome. I'm like, I'm like, not again. But she was describing all these things, that what they were seeing on the news. And I was like, no, I'm literally here. Like, I'm right where you're talking about. I'm like, we haven't seen that. I'm like, we're the unit here too. Like, it's us. Like, so then I was like, they're totally full of crap, like just lying. The guys in my unit that went overseas, they were told to put their gas masks at the bottom, like their duffel bag. Like, we're not going to find any weapons of mass destruction or biohazard weapons here. Like, they just don't exist. The only weapons we found were the ones we sold them in the 80s, right? Like, funny how that works. But then when I was at the border too, I would say maybe half the people were nationals from Mexico. Maybe half. I remember distinctly one night, it was like 2 in the morning. We see this white guy, like we're in the night vision. We see this white guy just like stumbling across the desert. And we're just thinking like, man, this must have been like a crazy bachelor party. Like, what is this guy doing in the middle of the desert in the middle of the night? because we were down by Arizona. And he was like speaking Russian or something. Like by the time we rolled up on him, we're like, dude, we don't know what you're saying, but like, but you can't be here. um, and funny thing is, when we were down at Katrina, we actually arrested probably more cops than anybody, which is a weird thing to say. It's a real weird thing to say. And they didn't want to go quietly, but we're like moving around the chief of police because we had the very tall, we had these things called HEMATs where the engines are up on top, so you can get real deep in the water. So we're driving around the police chief and all these people like, we'll take you where you need to go. And we just got done arresting a couple cops, and he was like, "Do any of you boys need jobs after this?" He's like, "I'm starting to be short-staffed," and we're like, "No, we're good." But anyways, that just taught me in a nutshell, like I can't trust the news. Like, when the next CIA director says that 600 plus newscasters were on CIA payroll, that's a huge red flag. Like, why? I don't understand why people don't get it, and I do kind of get it, but what I see is people just, and I can't prove they're lying, but I don't trust the liar, right? Like, fool me once, shame on you, right? Um, but when I hear things like, we'll say Israel and Palestine, like right now happening, like literally right now, both sides are pointing fingers, and I say they both could technically be right, but I know something's happening, but what they're telling me, I don't believe it's it. Because every time I've ever been somewhere where there's been news in the military, it's never the way the news was saying it, not once. So I think, man, you just can't trust it, right? So that's where, like, people, I think, just they hear something and it's that confirmation bias. See, I knew those Jews attacked a hospital. See, I knew they were just killing babies and beheading them. But then it comes out after people want to be first, right? They don't want to be right. News doesn't want to be right. They want to be first now. And now there's no consequences. Like, we know that now we think we know, Hamas rocket blew up. It just didn't launch, like failure to launch. Misfires happen all the time, especially if you're using maybe older stuff. Um, but anyway, so that kind of, I don't want to say jaded me, but I don't watch TV. It's called television with daily programming. Like, it's right there. Like, if people, because there's power in words, right? Like, we learn as Christians, or we learn as people to believe like there's power in words. Like, don't even say stuff joking. Um, so anyways, I don't listen to fools, right? So I'm not going to listen to the news because it's not even worth the time. But what is the alternative, right? Like, it's just, there's no accountability anymore. And I think that's the problem. Like, back to even the BBC in the New York Times, like, yeah, the Israeli army blew up a hospital. I'm like, y'all were totally wrong. And that had real world consequences. People got really mad about hearing something like that, you know?
Yeah.
And like how we were over in Iraq for 20 years, if somebody invaded our country and blew up my uncle, I'm going to remember who killed my uncle 20 years from now. We make more enemies than anything. I don't know why we can't see it. It's very sad. But violence begets violence. Like, the military made me a pacifist.
So there's a woman I've had on my show a couple of times named Lori Calhoun. She's a philosopher and an author, and she's a writer for the Libertarian Institute, and she's just incredible on a lot of issues, and a lot of her work has focused on the military-industrial complex and war propaganda, and she published a book a few months ago, and we did a deep dive over that book on my show a few months back called Questioning the COVID Company Line. And one of the points that she makes in that book is that the exact same set of tools that were used to create propaganda that enticed Americans to support the war efforts and the war on terror are the same set of tools that the government rolled out in response to the COVID pandemic. And so there's this overlap between the government's pandemic response and then also the way that propaganda is crafted in order to convince people to support wars that may or may not be justifiable. So the question that I have for you then is, what's wrong with the mainstream narratives in the United States surrounding health and wellness? There's a lot of information that's out there being pushed by the government and other organizations that receive funding from the government about health. You have the FDA and other organizations like that. What is wrong with the way that we conceptualize health in our country today, as well as the way that the government controls and regulates the medical industry?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple real big things, and I don't like to use big words for the layperson. The easiest way I say it is, If people want to have a debate with me on vaccines, like in a true like doctor to doctor, let's talk science, after like 5 minutes, they don't want to have a debate anymore because they don't have any science to back them up. So there's a thing called publication bias, for example, meaning I own Wellbutrin, so I'm going to run some studies about Wellbutrin, and the placebo group did better than the group with the Wellbutrin. We're not going to publish it, but let's run it again. We're flipping the coin, right? So if we look at certain SSRIs, I forget the one exactly. At last time I checked, there was like 24, 25 articles saying this worked better than the placebo. But they have 26 unpublished studies that they didn't finish and put in the articles. It said, well, the placebo group actually did better. And then they start to confound it. So then we get a little more technical. They're like, well, the placebo ran off after 8 weeks, so we can't really say it's good. I'm like, but if you know anyone on antidepressants, what do they say after 4 to 6 to 8 weeks? It's not really working, doc. I'm not feeling it like I was. So what do? They change their placebo now too, right? So anyway, so there's publication bias, there's pay to publish. So the way they get by without declaring a conflict of interest, I'm Merck or whatever, I pay for a wing at Harvard. I donate all that money to Harvard, and then the doctors run studies for my drugs. And they better publish what I want them to say. Because if they don't publish what I want to say, guess who's not going to fund the school anymore? So I'm not paying that doctor directly, because then we have to call it a conflict of interest. But I can give millions of dollars to a department in a school if I'm a pharmaceutical company, and they're guaranteed to get those research grants. That's the money they get. So huge COI. But when we look at it, and then to kind of just like take it into the COVID thing, I say, Pfizer, if you look at the amount of money they have paid, they are the most fraudulent company of all time. They've paid more in fraud than anyone. And they have like totally caused coups in Africa to keep people from suing them for like practicing on third world countries. Like that was about to be a huge payout. I think it was something like over $12 billion. So anyways, so I say this company basically designs fraud charges into their business model. Hey, I'm just going to lose a few from some of the lawsuits, but as long as we're making more, then it doesn't really matter. So if we view a company as a person, which under American law we can say Pfizer is a person. We'll call him Jack for right now. Jack's been on fraud count in prison for fraud multiple times, over a dozen. He's definitely killed people in those fraud charges. People died from some of the stuff they lied about, making up the way that the drugs work or how effective they are, dismissing the side effects. So now we have a virus that now the only solution is a shot. So we take Jack and we say, Jack, we're going to give you a ton of taxpayer money, around the tune of $200 million. We need you to run a safety study on this vaccine. Your doctors, your crew, you just tell us the numbers. Show us what works. And then you're guaranteed blanket immunity. No one will ever sue you for this great product that you put out. So, of course, they're going to say it's 100% effective. But so I am a nerd. I tell my wife one day I'll have friends, but right now I just read research. So, because Pfizer was sued where you have to release the safety studies, they were trying to delay it for 75 years. So that way, at this point, everyone's dead, anyone that actually cares, because nobody's going to make it. They're off the board. All those guys are dead. Everyone that got hurt by the jabs are dead. Who cares, right? They made their money. So they looked at there's about 50,000 people in each group. The study with the shots, only one person died of COVID. The study without the shots, the placebo group, 2 people died of COVID. Well, 2 is 100% more than 1. It's 100% effective now. Oh, see what I did there? When in reality, it's what's 1 out of 50,000, like 0.0 some percent effective. But then if you take those exact same numbers, something like 6 people had heart attacks in the COVID group. Only 2 had heart attacks of the 50,000 people in the placebo group. So then if you take their exact same numbers, I'd say, well, for every 1 person they save from COVID, they caused 4 heart attacks. That's just one line. I mean, that's just one part of the study. So anyways, the way I think of it is we don't even have to get into the science, which we can though, but we take one of the most fraudulent companies on the planet, they run their own safety study, and it takes lawsuits for them to actually release the results. Which, fun fact, and I'm not anti-vaccine, just for the record. I tell people, you want to do it, go ahead. I don't care. But in 1985, if we view vaccines in general, like the child ones, all right, like measles, mumps, rubella, stuff like that, pertussis. In 1985, there was something only like 5 or 6 shots on the market. That was it. Guess what every pharmaceutical company was about to do? They're about to quit making them. They're like, we're getting sued too much. These shots, not even worth it. We're going to just stop. So Congress said, whoa, ho, ho, let's not jump the gun here. Let's make taxpayers responsible for any damages. We'll shield you from any liability, and we'll shield the doctors as well, because we don't want them to lose their license. And that was the law in 1986 called like the National Vaccine Injury Prevention Program or some crap like that. But anyways, we look at something because Pfizer made like what, an extra how many billions of dollars? So they use taxpayer money to pay for the cost. They crowdsource the cost, but then they privatize the profits, right? Which is to me like super weird. Like I'm waiting for my check from Pfizer. Like, look, my taxes paid for you to do that. Like, where's my part of the $100 billion, right? You know. But anyways, so if we just start to view it as kind of like there's this huge financial incentive and there's no downside. Like this one guy that writes for like it was something big like Wall Street Journal or Economics something where and he didn't even talk about efficacy of vaccines. He was just talking about it's a great model. He's like, look, if I am shielded immunologically from any financial obligations from the government, they're going to pay for all the R&D. I'm guaranteed a profit because it's now a healthcare standard. Every kid gets a hepatitis B vaccine upon the day of birth because I don't know why. Maybe it's because all the prostitute drug addicts don't go into the healthcare clinics to get their hepatitis B shot. So they have billions of doses just sitting around that nobody wants. So they're like, let's just give them to every kid on the first day they're alive. How does this make sense yet? So and don't even get me started. So we've heard of sudden infant death syndrome, right? Now we have sudden, what is it now that all the adults are just dropping like flies, basically? I mean, there's what, like 1,500 athletes in the past 2 years that have dropped on the pitch. That's more than the last 40 years combined. But anyways, these nerds did a meta, or they looked at they looked at what's called VAERS, Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. So people throw stones at VAERS. They'll say, well, anyone can just submit a claim. The reason why most doctors don't submit claims, you know how much paperwork it takes? It is a ton of paperwork. I have been a, what's it called? A professional witness in the vaccine damage court. I've actually been there. One of my patients, she got the pneumococcal vaccine and started to have seizures, and she died in her sleep from one of her seizures. So of course they're like calling me and I'm like, look, I'm just a chiro. Like they're not even going to listen to what I have to say, which they didn't. And that's, I guess, okay. But anyways, I forgot where I was going with that. It's a ton of paperwork to claim a vaccine damaged somebody, and B, it's a felony to falsify a claim. So there's not a bunch of crunchy moms just making up vaccine damage. So I'm Pfizer, so I do this safety study. So there's never been a pre-licensure safety study ever done on any vaccine ever. What they say with the shots is, we'll do post-marketing surveillance. That's VAERS. That's exactly what VAERS is. We're going to roll it out and we're just going to check. We're going to see what's going on with it. So then when you actually point it out, hey, if we look at VAERS, we can see, for example, statistical analysis just showed 79% of the kids that die of SIDS had more than one shot within 24 hours. The other 10% had the flu shot within 24 hours. So if you're telling me that basically 9 out of 10 kids, we can point and say they all had shots within 24 hours, what's the deal? Because we're not quite old enough yet, but our parents are old enough. SIDS was a made-up term. It didn't even exist until the 70s. Like, then they had to start, why are these kids dying in their sleep? I can tell you why. There is zero reason for neurological tissue to stop working. They lose the ability to breathe. They don't suffocate. the brainstem stops. We see it all the time. A milder version would be an adult with sleep apnea. Even if they're not overweight, we're like, oh, I got sleep apnea. We're like, yeah, your brainstem, which controls your breathing when you're unconscious, isn't working that great. You can't even breathe when you're asleep. Like that's how altered your nervous system function is. So, anyways, not to get on a podium, then I just say we it's just a shame that we have all these things going on. And so that's with just traditional vaccines with like the heavy metals. And we won't even spend the time getting into that science because I can poke holes like that in Swiss cheese. But so when COVID vaccine was first being developed, I talked to my friend. I'm not going to name names. He has 2 PhDs. One is in genetics, so he's a true geneticist. His other PhD is in neuroimmunology. He's like my best friend. when he has a PhD, I'm like, so I'm thinking like, well, this is because so when we look at the COVID shot, it's not a traditional shot. It's not like we sprinkled in a dead COVID virus, added some aluminum to make it mad, and then inject that into people. It's a transgene therapy. They changed the definition of the word vaccine to allow COVID shots to be called vaccines because they're not. They're transgenetic therapies, which means they take a gene that's not even a human gene, and then they inject it into people. And now we're starting to see that. And back to the Pfizer safety study, they unblinded the study after 90 days. So now you can never do what's called a long-term analysis where we're like, hey, 5 years later, what are the cancer rates? 10 years later, what are the fertility rates? Let's like actually look at these things. So they unblinded the study because it was getting bad, real bad. I could show the data right now. Well, I could discuss it because we're on a podcast. The UK government's own numbers are showing the rate of just death from 18 to 39-year-olds for the 4th dose. If you're unvaccinated, it's like 23 people for every 100,000 human years. It's something like over 100 for the 4th dose. And these are the government's own numbers. I mean, people are just literally dropping like flies. And then there's a couple lies that we start to realize, like, well, it doesn't just stay in the arm. It doesn't just go away. Like they've done postmortem analysis of people that have died after the COVID shot. One particular lady, she was like in her 80s or something, but she got her COVID shot like 10 months prior. And they were like, we found spike protein in every organ. Everything we looked for, we found it. It's embedded in their DNA now. One of the things that I was just reading too, they found what's called the SV40 genes. So this was a lot of the shots that caused cancer back in the 60s and 70s because it's called simian virus 40. And when we think of how they make the COVID shots, because it's a transgene therapy, it's not like a traditional vaccine grown in a cell culture line. There's 0 reasons for there to be SV40. They don't have to even be anywhere close to that. So then it's like, well, why is that stuff in there? Why are they putting genes or simian viruses that are known to turn off what's called tumor suppressing genes? They're in there. So back to the VAERS, right? We have the citizen database, but then there's a thing called like NDISSD or something like that, where it's for VAERS, but it's for the military personnel. And this was huge. So there's a lieutenant colonel. She had to start grounding her pilots because she's like, hey, this is some weird stuff going on. I don't think they're fit to fly. I don't want them passing out or something in the middle of a jet and just, going into the mountainside or something. So she starts grounding people and they start looking at this database. So this thing is like a giant database of all service members, civilians, if you're in the military, active duty, whatever. And it's enough people where they can just start to crunch a bunch of numbers and they put everyone's healthcare records in there. So you can start to run a ton of data. She found basically things like, cancer rates are about 500 times what they have been in the past. And they looked at just, I believe the year was 2020 when it first came out. And they included the year of COVID, 2019, right? Because that's whenever the wild type virus was out before anyone could get their hands on a vaccine. And then they looked at the 5-year average before 2020 because they're like, we don't want any, flukes. We want to make sure this is a good data set. We're showing averages. We're not trying to cherry pick things. Cancer rates were through the roof, autoimmunity through the roof, cardiovascular events was something like 10,000%, or maybe 1,000%. And that's where I don't have the data sets in front, but it was high. So she becomes a whistleblower. She's protected by whistleblower status. And the Department of Defense is told, you have to preserve this data. So that's the first thing they did, was get rid of it. But then their rebuttal was, well, no, these rates aren't actually higher after the COVID vaccine was released. We just did it wrong for the 5 years beforehand. Everybody was having those amounts of heart attacks and strokes and cancer. We just don't know how to check the boxes correctly. And so then my rebuttal would be like, so who got fired? Right? Like, if you can't do it right for 5 years, that's literally your job. Like, how, so who's the lieutenant colonel or general, or like, who's fired, right? Like, who's actually in trouble? Because when we look at this, nobody's actually in trouble, right? Like, it's well known now. They made the lab in Wuhan. I mean, they have the PMID numbers and they have the grant numbers from our own NIH paying for this stuff. I mean, she was literally called the Bat Lady. Like, I mean, so we know that it was made. I mean, and that's where, if you look at other fishy stuff like Moderna, they did a patent on their COVID shot a month before it was even officially ever, hey, there's even COVID around. Like, super weird, right? So they funded it, but that's where I'd say, like, why is nobody in jail? All these people have lied and died and stuff like that. But like the CEO of Pfizer, he's fine. And funny thing, he didn't even get his shot. Remember? If you remember, he was trying to fly into Israel and he was like, oh, you're not vaccinated. He's like, oh, I didn't want to jump the gun. Really? If this virus is so bad that everyone's just, dying in the streets of China, like they were showing those videos, like, are people just dying in the streets? Like, really? Really? You wouldn't be the first one in line to just stab that in your arm as fast as you can? Like, don't give me this pious, like, oh, I care about people now, or anything like that. But then they were also on the record, because the Australian government was like, we're subpoenaing you, like, you better tell the truth. And they said, oh, well, we took vaccines that were different than everyone else. So it's like, I think they got placebos. Not to sound mean, but none of them are just dying unexpectedly. Bill Gates isn't like just having a heart attack after a jog or something like that. So I think I can't prove it. They're not getting it. I mean, that's my hunch. Like, there's no way, because they have access to this data. And nothing against doctors that look at it, because a lot of doctors, when we look at like a data set, like, hey, show me the research, you don't actually see the results. They just give you an Excel spreadsheet. They can totally like fudge those numbers all the time. It happens a lot. Because whenever we look at back to research and that kind of pay to play mentality, there's a thing where we have what's called an impact factor for a journal, meaning how impactful is the research, is it good quality research, is it answering crazy questions that just we need to know to help people. The higher the impact factor, the higher the rate of retraction every stinking time. Like, New England Journal of Medicine is considered like the research journal. They have the highest rate of retraction of all time. So, because it pays, even the authors of these studies are like, well, a couple of reasons why. A, they're fudging the numbers. They need it to look good, so that way they can keep getting funding. So they just do what they do to make it, because we know politicians are bought, but so are scientists and things like that. But then if you're published, your name is very popular. Like, when we think of kind of shifting gears, there's actually been like meteorologists, like people with PhDs about the air and stuff like that in our environment. And they're like, yeah, because this one guy, he did a study and he was showing that, hey, there could be an increase in hurricanes due to global warming or whatever. And he was like, I knew that wasn't the case, because if you look at the data set I actually submitted, like, it didn't demonstrate that really at all. He's like, but the way I worded it, but that research article was cited over like 3,000 times. Everyone's like, look, it's causing increased hurricanes. So they just run with it, kind of like the news. They find something that adheres to their bias. So they're like, see, I told you so. And then they just shout it from the rooftops. And not to say like, because I know we're kind of off, but I would say I don't think global warming exists right out of the gate. But I think we need to clean up our planet. I just don't know why the green agenda, the answer is always more taxes and more control of the population. That seems to be the only solution. It's not like, hey, can we actually get a manufacturer to make a refrigerator that lasts longer than 2 years? Like, I mean, we have a new house. I already replaced the dishwasher. I mean, it was like a year and a half old, things falling apart. I'm like, stuff's just built to break so they can sell a new one. But like, so if we really want to maybe decrease the impact on the environment, why don't we just build stuff that like actually works instead of just like another one so they can build it again? I mean, like cell phones, right? If I drop this thing's going to shatter in a heartbeat. But if you remember the old Nokias, like, oh my gosh, you could like slam it in a
Oh
puddle
yeah,
and just go back to playing Snake.
they last forever.
Yeah, I say, I
Right.
think, yeah, you could run it
Right.
over and be like, oh, I
I
can
know that
still make a call.
I really do think that there have been a lot of people that have been awakened to the fact over the last couple of years that the government definitely lied to us during the pandemic, not just about the government's own response to the pandemic, but also about the vaccines and other, pharmaceutical and non-pharmaceutical interventions. There was just a lot of lying to us. And I think that there are a lot of people that are starting to wake up and realize that not only were they lying about that, but they've also been lying about a lot of other things related to our health. But I know that there are a lot of people out there that got the vaccine because they were either forced to get it or they were coerced to get it in some way. Their employer said they were going to lose their job, or there are other forms of soft coercion that regret getting it. So if you're one of those people that got the vaccine and regretted getting it and you're worried about its long-term consequences for your health, what can those people do about that?
Well, I would say not to be the Debbie Downer. I would say I believe the correct answer is I don't know. Not to sound mean, but there's obviously things we do clinically. But I
Yeah.
just always talk to people. I say anyone that acts like they know 100% what's happening with this stuff, they're so full of it. Like they're just lying to you. Like nobody knows. Like this was the experiment, right? Like we're watching it real time. Because if we look at like myocarditis, for example, um, the 5-year mortality rates, this 10-year survivability rates, those things change. So that's where when I start looking at the year, like back to that fourth dose, like people are like it's statistically significant between unvaccinated and people continuing to vaccinate. But I just tell my wife, we hadn't seen nothing yet. The myocarditis isn't really even going to kick in till year 5. After that point, it starts to become 50-50, and then it goes downhill even after that. So a couple things that we think we know. The spike protein goes everywhere. It gets embedded in your DNA. So the big thing for a lot of clotting issues that I find, we have to give them proteolytic enzymes. Lumbrokinase is probably one of my favorite ones, also called Boluque, Boulouke, or Boluque. Because that can help with kind of the clotting, because when they did postmortem analysis, they would start looking at people. And this actually wasn't doctors. These were actually embalmers, because the embalmers were like, we're having trouble getting the embalming fluid through them. Like something's jamming up their vasculature. So they would start pulling out all this white fibrous stuff. So I just tell people it's not clots. It's fibrous tissue. They're growing connective tissue. We start running enough blood work on people. We're looking at their fibrinogen. We're seeing their fibrinogen. I just reviewed a patient with a doctor today. Fibrinogen was 700. For reference, we usually don't like to see it above 150. They had a couple other markers going on that were indicative of like, ooh, you're kind of at risk of strokes and stuff like that too. So we need to break down that fibrous tissue. That's what proteolytic enzymes do. They break down proteins, and that's what that stuff is. Traditionally, we would use it for like scar tissue, maybe someone with rheumatoid arthritis, and they're like, wow, my knuckles don't hurt as much. Or maybe someone with mold, which actually my first COVID vaccine damaged patient, she had POTS, but she also had mold exposure. So I was giving her these proteolytic enzymes to stop or to break down the biofilm, like the plaque that mold make. And she was like, she messaged me. She's like, hey, doc, what's in that stuff? She's like, my tachycardia is gone. Like my heart rate just went away. And, it took me a while to piece it together because, again, this is all new. And I was just like, I think we were breaking down fibrous tissue. Like your heart was pumping harder because it knows it has to get stuff where it needs to go. And now that resistance is gone, so it can just chill. That's what I say. So I usually start doing something like that for people with autoimmunity. So I already have autoimmunity. And so I just say, look at the safety studies. Like to me, I think one of the worst advice that people were given, the best thing you can do for your unborn child is get vaccinated. I say, do you know who they kicked out of the studies? Pregnant women and women nursing. We know it passes in through the breast milk. And the New England Journal of Medicine, they published a study, forget when, back when the COVID vaccines first came out, and they compared like 820 pregnant women that got the shot. And then they looked at the miscarriages rates, but they only looked at the miscarriage rate of the last trimester, the third trimester, which was only 120 people. And they did that because most of the women that had a miscarriage was in the first trimester by far. If we combine and we looked at all 820 women instead of just 120, and then we looked at how many got the shots and how many had miscarriages, it was like 80%. I mean, it was like super high. And what's happening now? Fertility rates in the UK are the lowest they've been for like since the 60s or something. Like fertility rates are starting to drop. So that's what I say. We don't know, right? Like, because I have women that have had 4 kids and get the shot, and now they can't get pregnant. They're failing IVF. And I just say 4 might be it. Like we can try. I have had some women get pregnant after they've had the COVID shot and they were having trouble. But I've had some women that were pulling out all the stops and just say, I don't know, like it's like something in your genes changed, obviously. So, but all that to the autoimmunity, for the patients that I work with, we'll start looking at their immune markers. We'll start looking at, well, how did your immune system respond? Like that one lady that was failing IVF, her white blood cell count went down to 2.1, which is so low they thought she had HIV. And I'm like, well, good thing you've been married for 20 years, probably not AIDS. So
Right.
but then we could see, and we took it a step further. So we ran some blood work on her and we were like, you're actually missing those precursor cells. Like in your bone marrow, you're just not making them anymore. We were able to get her white blood cell count up, but we had to go into helping her bone marrow make it. And we have to help with the clotting, and we have to help with the hormone imbalances. So if we know enough about the person, we can try to see, well, these are like where your weak links are. But I would say the easiest thing, well, the things I would do the most, if it was me and I had to, I would probably just stay on a proteolytic enzyme, low dose, just for a while. Patients ask me, how long do I have to do this? I say, I don't know. In the research, the only thing we know is 10 months, that postmortem analysis. It was still in that lady 10 months after her vaccine. Could be longer, could maybe not be longer. I've heard of some geneticists say this stuff is going to be embedded in me and my kids and my kids' kids, because now it's kind of altered stuff. So I don't like to be a doomsdayer or anything like that. So I would probably do that. I would definitely get out in the sunlight. I would do the hippie stuff. I would eat foods available in the season. I would only eat during the daytime. I would definitely sleep at night. Do not stay up late. Like, I can't say it again. Do not stay up late. Every single cell is a slave to the sun. It's been here as long as we have. We were designed to be part of it. And our skin is a solar system for our immune system and our nervous system for what the sun does to it. We think vitamin D because that's what everyone talks about, but it's well beyond that. I mean, I've seen some kids stop developing seizures when we get them off of the blue light. So, spectrum of light is huge. So I'd say we got to get back to nature more than anything. And if I had the money for a lab and I could crowdsource the US taxpayers to do it, I'd say, well, what caused this? We took a gene that wasn't human and we inserted it in humans. So if that's what caused it, then I would say, well, then the solution, in my opinion, and I'm not a geneticist, shouldn't we try to insert a gene that gets rid of the gene we just put in? Because if that's the problem and it's being embedded in people's DNA, then that's the kind of the solution. Like, that's why, like, when I work with a kid with autism, we're like, well, what was it? Were they kind of born that way? Did you have maybe stress in the womb? Was it after the MMR? Did they hit their head? Did they get sick? Like, because then if we know, well, this is what triggered it, this is where we need to go with it. Like, Occam's razor, right? All things being equal, simplest solution tends to be the right one. Um, but like back to, what could have people done during the in the throes of it? I'd say everything they told us not to do. They closed the gyms, they closed the playgrounds. We couldn't get outside, we couldn't exercise. If you look at the people that simply died from having COVID, like 80% of them had issues with insulin resistance. So they were like overweight or diabetic or something along those lines. And then we would lump into another category. They were low in vitamin D, being outside, and they were low in glutathione. They just didn't have the antioxidant status that they need. But if we go a little bit further, if we look at people with low glutathione status, they're usually autoimmune because glutathione balances out the immune response like a seesaw going up and down. It's that fulcrum in the middle. It tries to keep the immune system nice and calm as much as it can. So I say, well, those are all the things that we were told not to do. So it's like they wanted to make somebody sick almost. Really weird. But you asked what made me initially skeptical. There's actually a Department of Defense. It's a training manual. I want to say it's like TM 150 something. But so a training manual is a military you get for the book for the military, like how to build grenades or how to do whatever you want to do. This one's about how to run a psyop, how to run a psychological operation. And so basically, in a nutshell, that book is if you repeat a lie loud enough and long enough, eventually people will accept it as the truth. So it's just unfortunate now because my heart does break for people that were forced to do this because I say, now it's so much, you can't hide it anymore. It's been out for a couple years at this point, and now we are really seeing a big difference between people that got shots, people that didn't get shots, and not like it's and I never want to have it be perceived like something is an absolute. Like that's where I try to make sure I check my own bias. Like I just always revert to autistic kids because I work with them. Well, I have kids on the spectrum that have never had a needle in their leg in their life, so it can't be the vaccines. But I see kids walking around the neighborhood, nothing wrong with them neurodevelopmentally, and they've had every shot that they were told to get. So why some? It's because the genes are all different genetically. And just nobody looked at those genes. Well, they kind of did. And Robert F. Kennedy even made an allusion to it where they're like, hey, we kind of noticed like people of Jewish descent and Asian descent aren't as affected by these viruses as much. Their mortality rates are like lower than other nationalities. And they're like, oh, he's a racist. I'm like, why? Because he pointed it out. Like, wouldn't that be, and I mean, we can pull it up. I'll have to find it, but I would say there was a guy talking for DARPA, which is, I don't know if you know who DARPA is. Okay, yeah. So they're the people building the
Oh yeah.
Terminators. In
Yep.
2017, he's talking and he's like some guy for DARPA. And he's talking about, well, we can release nanoparticles and that can trigger strokes in people in a certain radius of where we release these nanoparticles. And then he said, and these nanoparticles stay in them indefinitely. They can't get rid of it. We've engineered it that way. So then I think, that was 2017, talking about nanoparticles, talking about stroking out. I was like, and what's happening to all these people with all these nanoparticles? So, I mean, I don't know. It's just, I mean, the guy that literally invented the technology, Dr. Malone, is like, this is a bad idea. And I'm like, who's the CEO of Pfizer to be like, no, don't worry. I know more than this guy about the technology he created, like, I mean, no one's a quack until they go against the mainstream, and they're meant to vilify them that way, which is why I won't name the guy with 2 PhDs. He even said, like, please don't, like, we'll have this conversation. He's like, but I don't want to be pariah. He like works at a college and, he's got kids, he's got mouths to feed. So I'd never do that to him. But I think that's to me the major problem. Anyone that does speak out, you're just browbeaten. They take your livelihood, they take whatever you want. There's even a guy going to prison now that was just there on January 6th that didn't even go inside. He was simply there recording it. And he is going to prison for 7 months they violated his First Amendment rights. Like, I don't know. Because, like, who's the guy that he did all the sciencey stuff and everyone views him as like the end all be all for physics or whatever. He's always like, well, actually,
Neil deGrasse Tyson. Yeah.
Yeah. He's like, oh, consensus is what determines scientific validity. And then I think, yeah, but the reason 10 out of 10 doctors say that this works is because the 20 that said it's a bad idea, you didn't give them a platform. You made the consensus. I was like, you falsely made it, but you made the consensus. So now as a consumer, we think, wow, all these. So it's also called the oh gosh, there's a couple different fallacies that we have, like straw man, like, hey, I'm just going to build up this thing and I can destroy it easily. So then I prove I'm right, like certain things like that. I forget exactly. Oh, it's a certain fallacy, but it's like the perception that, well, it's Harvard, they got to be right. It's the New England Journal of Medicine, they got to be right. And that's why I bring up stuff like, well, they have the highest retraction factor of all time. Like, that the zoologic origins of COVID, where they said there's no way COVID was made in the lab. It had to be from some pangolin having sex with a bat and a lady eating the raw soup or something. I don't even know what the story was supposed to be, but I'm like, really? That's your cover story? So but it's I mean, hindsight's 2020, right? Like but that's where I was damaged by anthrax shots in the army. I have vitiligo. And that's what I just say, I'm not an anti-vaxxer, I'm an ex-vaxxer. I used to do it too. Getting in the military, you never get more shots when you're in the military. Trust me. And if you're told you're going overseas, times that by like 5. Because you get all the experimental
Yeah.
ones. But I'm actually a documented vaccine damage case. So I just told my wife, I didn't make it through those shots. I don't want my kids to see if they're going to make it. I don't care if my kid gets chicken pox. My son had measles, big whoop, he got a rash. Like, who cares? Like, but then other parents are like, oh, your kid hasn't been vaccinated. Oh, keep him away from mine. I'm like, but I thought your kid was vaccinated. Don't they work? Like, does my bike helmet doesn't need you to wear a bike helmet for my bike helmet to work? Like, right? Like how retarded is this conversation? So I don't know if I should say that. It's kind of, I'm very like nonchalant. So I say things that maybe aren't politically correct. I still call everybody dude, even if they're a
You're in good
guy.
company here, Jared.
Did you just misgender me? No. um, so, but that's sort of because someone was like, oh, I don't identify as a man. I'm like, look, I call my mom dude. Like, I'm not making an exception for you. Like, it's just the way it is. Like, if you don't like it, don't
Right.
talk to me. I don't
Right.
care. Um, but the best course of action,
Yeah.
that's where staying outside, just balancing blood sugar too. And I try not to overthink diet. We've worked together, so we can definitely get into the weeds of it. But I just say, if it's in a box or a bag, it's bad for you. If it says it's good for you, it's bad for you. There's not like commercials about how good broccoli is for people. Everybody knows it's good for you. So, but if it's processed and manufactured, I'll say, cooking at home is probably the best thing most parents can do. Honestly, if I had to choose just one thing without knowing anything about someone's diet, I'd be like, just cook. Just make it yourself. You know what's in it. You can buy the ingredients, source it, you know? So I just wanted to go through some of the questions that we had too. Like, why did they try to promote the shots? Well, from a government standpoint, it's a revolving door, right? The head of the FDA is the CEO of Pfizer, just a different year, and they just rotate. So, if I was
Yeah.
president, I would be assassinated before I could finish signing it. But my first executive order, there can be no interplay between that. If you're a government, you cannot go work for anything that lobbying is gone. No more. There's just no lobbyists. If you're Pfizer, I don't care how many billions of dollars I have, you can't talk to Congress members, you can't talk to judges, you can't talk to anyone. You can't give money, nothing. It's gone. Because how does somebody like Elizabeth Warren, who gets 175 grand a year being a US senator, now she's worth something
Yeah.
like 20 some
Something like that.
million dollars? Like I don't work for NASA, but I did get a 5 on my math like AP test for calculus. So I think I can add. It's like, where did all that money come from? So they're inside trading stocks, they're doing all these things. I mean, if you look at the timing of Bill Gates for his Pfizer stock, it was perfect. He bought it a few months before the COVID shot came out, sold it literally a few weeks before all this stuff starts to come out, and they just start tanking. Now they're 25% lower than they were before they ever brought out the COVID shot. Because hopefully, back to it's a fraudulent company, hopefully everyone learned Jack is kind of a jerk and they're just not going to use his product anymore. So, so it's always money. I mean, right? Like how you're discussing that other podcaster, you can't have a multi-trillion-dollar military industrial complex if you don't have wars. You can't have a multi-billion-dollar health industrial complex if you don't have a ton of sick people. And I just tell my patients, a hospital is like a hotel. If that bed is empty, they're losing money. They need you to be sick. If everyone woke up healthy tomorrow, hey, I'd be out of a job, but I'd be okay with it. I'd be like, oh, thank God there's no more autistic kids. Yay. But then I'd be like, our economy would collapse if everyone was healthy. Weird. Half of our economy is designed to take care of the other half of the people that are sick. So it's a really weird like conundrum that we can find too. The mask mandates, because we had some typed up things for people wondering, and I can gab, and I just want to make sure we cover everything in adequate time. If not, we're going forever. Control, right? Who's going to listen? Who's not going to listen? And they even did a meta-analysis, and that was from the Cochrane collaboration, and it was actually published a few months ago. And they're like, yeah, masks don't work like at all. And then, of course, Fauci's on TV. Well, there's a couple studies that maybe indicate otherwise. And literally the lead author, because Cochrane is a meta-analysis, they get rid of crap studies. He's like, oh, the other studies that we got rid of because they're not worthy of being a meta-analysis? Yeah, he's quoting those studies. So like, did you ever watch Dallas Buyers Club? Probably not, because we're on a
no, I didn't. But I'm familiar with the premise of the movie, yeah.
Yeah. So there's this one line, and I'm not going to repeat it because he swears, but it's Matthew McConaughey, and they're talking about going down to Mexico to buy the drugs for AIDS and stuff. And they were talking about why can't this stuff be in the US? And he said, effing Tony Fauci. He's the AIDS guy too. So I don't want to blow people's minds. We know COVID was made in the lab. Where do you think HIV came from? Don't get me started on that. So, anyways, but he's the same guy. He's a central player. He's not even a good doctor. He's not even an epidemiologist. He's not an infectious disease doctor. So I think, how did he go from a family practice who wasn't even that good at it to now he's considered like America's doctor? I'm like, I don't know, man. But money pays the bills, right? His wife was the one that was able to give people emergency youth authorization. So that would be part of the other thing too. Like you can't family members can't be in it. Like this can't be like a Bush thing where like, oh, I'm just going to be a president and a vice president, and then I got my son doing it too. like come on, man. Because we know the ability of actually moving up from the working class to something like what we might consider elite or super rich. It's the same as in feudal China. It's the same as like in the Dark Ages. Like it doesn't happen. I think the last kid that actually did it, he made Minecraft. That was like literally the most recent kid that came from like working class, like, hey, I'm a billionaire. He made a video game. So, but it's never going to happen what we typically think about. And I do think that there is that positive that people like don't trust it now, right? Like they've been burned. Like back to me and my autoimmune diseases from the anthrax shots in the army. Like that was my lesson. It took some, but that's to me where it's the hard part is like it can be a pricey lesson for some of these people. I mean, like I have one doctor. So I have a doctor mentorship group. I teach docs how to do this so they're not completely terrible at functional medicine, basically, because it's like the Wild West. She's an oncology doctor. She straight up tells me the beds and chairs are fuller than they've ever been. The tumors are so aggressive and metastasizing so fast. All we're doing, we're just doubling the radiation and burning people's skin. We don't even know how to get in front of it. Back to the SV40 tumor suppressing genes. My friend's husband's brother, maybe a couple months after his shot, he's 31 years old, testicular cancer that metastasized to his brain, liver, lungs, and bone. He was dead within a few weeks. No family history of cancer. So I say they unfortunately learned their lesson. It took them losing a family member to do it, but they didn't get any shots after that. You know, I had one patient, she has autoimmunity. She was the only member in her family that didn't get the COVID vaccine. They're having a baby shower. She's inside the house through the glass looking at her first grandbaby. Yeah, first grandbaby. Couldn't touch her, boo the unvaccinated. They're spreading the disease. They're giving us all these things. Her nephew died a few weeks later, 18 years old, of a massive stroke. I have a 6-year-old patient that's just had a stroke. What 6-year-old patient has strokes? What 6-year-olds have strokes? I don't know any before this now. So that's where I would say people are waking up, but it's a painful process. And I wish it wasn't, because I have a lot of people sometimes saying to me, why aren't you trying to tell more people this? And I'm like, look, I've been trying to tell people for over a decade. Like, my voice is tired at this point. Like, I don't know any other ways to say it. And when I do, I get like, there's no visibility on social media. Everybody knows those algorithms are suppressed. Like, I just showed government data. It's got maybe like 4 likes, but I share a picture of my son, 38 shares, 1 billion likes, like all this stuff, right? So the algorithm's not designed back to the consensus. They're engineering the consensus. So now, well, he's just a quack. I heard it from some random chiropractor. What does he know? I said, well, probably more than most, for not to sound mean, but everyone's a genius in their own wheelhouse, right? Like, I'm not a mechanic. I look at a car that's broke down and like,
right.
Better call Firestone, somebody. Like, I can do some stuff. Like, I could, but cars are different now. Like, I remember we had a 1976 step-side Chevy truck. At 6 years old, I could do more on that truck than I could on a car right now. Like, changing the battery was like a 3-hour process on my Jeep. And I'm just like, why is this so hard? Oh, yeah, because they want me to pay somebody to go do it, not just change it myself. Anyway, so I think there's going to be a long-term paradigm shift. It's just the getting through that process. And to me, it's kind of one of the weirder business models. I'm like, if we think of it as Pfizer, I'm like, you're killing your consumers. Like, the people that are taking the shots are the ones dying. Like, aren't you kind of killing your patient base or something? Like, so the practical steps, because I always like to see what people can do for themselves. Attitude is everything, honestly. Because I talk to people, and as you know, I'm not the cheapest option on the block. I say, if you want the cheaper doctor, there's somewhere over there, and that's fine. It's okay. It is what it is, right? But I always try to think of, well, the most studied thing on the planet is the placebo group. If I think the sugar pill is going to help me, magically my blood pressure gets lower. If I think the sugar pill is going to help me, half the time it works better than the SSRIs that they publish in the studies. It's a coin toss. So our perception is extremely important, because I screen people, because I say this is a big commitment for both of us, time, money. Like, I don't just work with anyone. I just say, if I get you feeling better, you lose weight, your joints don't hurt, whatever, are you still just going to sit on the couch and complain, or like, what are we going to do here? But that's where I'd say cooking from home, having a good attitude, even if somebody doesn't have everything they want. I would just say, if you have a house, water, electricity, and food, I could probably think of about 5 billion people on this planet that would trade places with you immediately. Like, we don't know how good we have it. Even poor people by American standards are rich in other countries. Like, rich. Yeah. They're like, oh, I only got this 2-bedroom home. I'm like, have you seen people living in huts made from like water bottles filled with sand? Like, could always be worse. So, but sleep would have to be the major component. If I had to choose one thing, I just say sleep is king. Back to that circadian rhythm. Don't eat late at night. Don't be exposed to blue light late at night. Those are the easiest things we can do. Definitely watch a sunrise. All these neuroscientists that have labs to like look at stuff, they're validating all the hippie things people would say. Oh, watch the sunrise. Don't eat after dark. Make sure you exercise. Ground. Get your feet on the grass for the electrons to get up into you. And like, these are actually valid claims now. There's like neuroscientists and doctors that work on longevity that are like, have we thought of eating seasonal vegetables instead of just eating broccoli year round, like our ancestors used to do? And I'm like, guys in charge, multiple $1 million like grants and research funds. His answer is sleep on time to get to get those deep delta waves for healing, to complete the healing cycle for every cell in our body. Eat seasonal food. Don't eat after dark. Exercise is medicine. Gratitude is medicine. He starts saying all these weird things that we're like, but that's too simple. And that's what I find is what works. Even though I deal with very complex patients like autism, I just say if healing is tough, it's because we've missed something basic. Once the body is in a state of healing, that's all it knows how to do, is react to the environment that it's in. So we can change the environment internally and externally. Body changes its function. So that's where I just say we have to think about the environments. So that way, and that's usually what a lot of the testing is for. Like, I don't want to divulge too much, but I just say I run a poop test on everyone. Because when we think of the environment, the GI tract is a major contributor to health, like trajectories, and that's a big environment we can check out. I look at mold for a lot of people because I deal with a lot of people that have maybe lived in water damaged homes and affected by mold. And they get out of the moldy house, kid quits having seizures, this quits happening. I'm like, look, the body's not making a mistake. It's just doing what it thinks it's best in the environment that it's in. It's coping as best it ever can. So that's where when I operate with people, like I would say, for example, everyone I've seen that I'd say, I think I have a pretty good batting average, and I'm not confident in myself. I'm confident in what God made. That's what I'm confident in. I know if we do what's right for the body, it'll do what's right for us. It's just finding that. And the problem is our conventional medicine, we're thinking of that plutonium math, 1+1 is 2, or that Newtonian, sorry. But if we know more about nature math, we're more like a Facconi sequence. Why does a snail shell have the exact same ratio as every other snail shell? We are that math. We are not 1+1 = 2. So even when we start looking at this, like I'll have people be like, is this why I have lupus? I'll be like, odds ratio says yeah, but I can't say it's 100%. Like I can never, that's not the way the body's math works. So that's where really I would say doing a lot of the what I would consider basics, balancing blood sugar, expressing gratitude, huffing and puffing. We can call it exercise. I tell my patients, I don't care what you do, but you need to be doing this during and after. Like, if it's an 80-year-old walking to the couch and she's huffing and puffing, then I'm like, good job, grandma. You did it. You did it. But if you're an 18-year-old that's never exercised, then like, look, you gotta get out there. Like, you gotta lift some weights. You gotta do something,
Right.
yeah. But so hopefully that wakes some people up, and just consistency is what carves canyons. Because when we think of someone's health trajectory, it can change. Like I remember one time I was eating dinner. It was me and my wife Julie, and we went out to eat with a friend and his friend. And this guy has gout and he's a little overweight, but he heard Julie ordering. She's like, hey, can I not get ketchup? Like, she didn't want ketchup. She just has food sensitivities, right? She's like, no gluten. I don't eat the bun. Because we went to like a grass-fed organic beef burger place in Cincinnati. And I remember he just looked at us after she ordered and he's like, the science says that y'all aren't going to live any longer than me. And I was like, you're absolutely right. I'm like, we agree. I'm not supposed to live longer than you. I'm supposed to live better than you, though. I was like, the science is very clear that my quality of life will far exceed yours. And I kind of just looked at his toe under the table, and not to sound mean, but he had a mild heart attack like 5 or 6 weeks later. And I'm just thinking, like, dude, like, not saying that like us not eating the buns is like, the reason we don't have heart attacks, but I'm like, but it's that meal, it's that consistency, man. Like day in and day out. What helps keep us stay married to our wives? It's not the vacations, and it's the consistency. It's the day in and day out, choosing to love each other, choosing to support each other, choosing to want what's better for them. So I say it's that, but we need to have that same kind of consistency with our body. Like sometimes it's as simple as like I just quit drinking that sugary Starbucks drink in the morning. My blood sugar is more stable. I can sleep better at night. I'm not irritable. I can remember. I'm like, funny. Didn't take any drugs to do that. And I'm not anti-drugs, but I'll just and I know we're over time, so I apologize. But I just think of it as if
Oh,
we
you're
gave
great,
Usain,
man.
I just tell people if we gave Usain Bolt, the fastest man on the planet, medication, are we going to make him faster or slower? They're like, well, slower, unless we give him like meth, then we might make him a little faster. But then I say, so if the medication won't make a healthy person healthier, why is that our only thought process to give a sick person a medication? And when we get into the science of it, the only medication that's ever been tested for more than one drug at a time is Effexor, because they designed it to be taken with Wellbutrin or something like that. So that's where when I work with people and they're like, well, I'm on this for sleep, I'm on this PPI, I take this for my cholesterol, and I take this for my blood sugar. I say, you are the experiment. Nobody's ever done any research looking at these four drugs in combination. So nobody knows what's happening in your body. I was like, in the cholesterol medication, we know is what's driving your blood sugars high. So we're just really having to start offsetting a lot of these things that we see because the medication is given under the assumption of, oh, your cholesterol's high, bad liver, trying to stroke out the brain or cause a heart attack. Like what? The liver is really going to try to make us commit suicide? Like that's like such an idiotic thought process. Versus us, we might think, well, why is your liver churning out cholesterol? It's the precursor to your stress and sex hormones, and it's the precursor to your cortisone to deal with inflammation. Like they give the cortisone cream. So, where's the inflammation? Where's the stress? Why is your liver doing this? Not assuming it's making a mistake. And I'm not anti-meds. I see people like, dear God, take your seizure medications, please. Like, let's not have a seizure. But on the back end, let's figure out why can't your brain control, firing? Like, let's focus on that instead. So that's all I wanted to have. I know there's maybe more questions and things like that, but I didn't want to go too over the timeline.
No, that was perfect. I think we covered just about everything that I wanted to get to today. And I know that like my own story with you is that I was suffering from chronic heartburn, like persistent heartburn for years. And I was relatively healthy, still very physically active, worked out most days a week. And ate a lot of fruits and vegetables. But I went to the doctor several times and they kept on telling me that the only solution to my problem was to take these drugs that had really negative side effect and that I would have to be on these drugs for the rest of my life. And I just was not happy with that answer. And it really was bad. Like basically every time I ate, I got heartburn. And we were able to you were able to identify through a couple of tests that I had some sort of infectious disease a long time ago and that there were remains of that in my system. And by modifying my diet and taking some minerals, we were able to clean that out. And I've not had heartburn in the last 4 years. So I know that functional medicine really works. And I think that if there is a silver lining to what has happened during COVID, there are a lot of people that are very skeptical about the mainstream medical narratives and that are looking for functional alternatives. So if somebody's interested in functional medicine and they want to get a hold of you, how can they get in contact with you?
Well, I always tell people just check me out first, due diligence, right? drjaredseigler.com. I'm the only one. So, but then I like to just meet with people, have a little quick chit chat. What are you dealing with? Let me learn about you. Like again, back to autism, I just tell parents, I've seen more autistic kids than I can even remember, but I've never met your kid. Let's focus on them, not the other kids. Where are you at? What's going on in your life? Like, because for most people, they view the right testing, the right supplements, the right diet. Like that's what's going to get me better. And I'll say that's true. But as a clinician on my end, the better communication we have, the more honesty and openness we can have, and we can really stay on top of things. To me, that's the biggest, like that's what's going to crack somebody's case. But I say to have that little short call, I say just speak with jared.com. I always keep it simple, KISS principle, right? So yeah, they say we can get on the horn, have a nice little chit chat, see maybe where some of the gaps are in your health or some of the major concerns. Like I don't run an emergency room. I jokingly tell my wife when I first started to do this, I wanted to see the toughest of the tough cases. I wanted to be known for helping people that other doctors couldn't help. And I think I'm pretty good at that. But now I told her, I really wish I was more careful what I wished for. Kind of like my dad said, I've never once prayed for God to teach me patience because I don't know if I could handle it. Um, you know, uh, But now I just think, could I just get someone with a headache maybe like once a year when they stay up late? Like, oh, easy fix, just don't stay up late. But anyways, the hotter the fire, the harder the steel. So I do work with those kinds of people. And that's where I just say I don't replace the emergency room for like my stroke patients. Like, if you think you're having a stroke, please, dear God, get to the ER. I was like, but my goal is to figure out, why are you having strokes? How can we rehabilitate from that stroke? And how can we try to position your body to not have another one? I say, and that requires a lot more digging.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Jared Seigler, thank you so much for coming on the show today. This has been great.
Thank you for having me. I hope everyone learned a little bit.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.